as the Irish in America are trying to advocate for an Irish republic, they also want to point out their loyalty to the United States, right? So they do, particularly again during the World War I years, sort of argue that, like we're American, we're patriotic, but we can still advocate for the Irish Republic.
That was Tara McCarthy, professor and author of the book Respectability and Reform, Irish American Women's Activism, 1880 to 1920. Hello and welcome to episode 138 of the Irish Baseball Podcast. I'm your host, Rick Becker. Tara McCarthy will be my guest on the show today as we return to our focus on the impact Irish immigrants and Irish Americans have made on the United States, with the 250th anniversary of the country coming up in July. McCarthy will focus on some of the women who have had their efforts forgotten by history. Many of these history conversations, including this one, were actually made available in video form for members of the Irish American Baseball Society weeks before the audio aired as a podcast. It is just one of the many reasons to visit the Community Network website if you are a member. If you still haven't joined yet, you can head to irishbaseball.org to be a part of the organization. Let's welcome Tara McCarthy to the Irish Baseball Podcast. Thanks for being here, Tara.
Thank you for having me.
I have a lot I want to ask you. I'm really excited to have you on the show, so we're just going to dive right into it. Irish American women were very politically active in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. But before we talk about any of those efforts, what was life like for these women at the time?
Well, I guess the first thing I would say is in the 19th century, when women first were coming over, many of them were young and single. And so they were working as maids in middle-class Protestant homes. So that you'll see in that first generation of Irish, overwhelmingly women worked in domestic service, which was living in someone else's home, working 6 days a week, being on call 24/7 with a day off. But one of the reasons they did this kind of work is because they had a place to live and the wages were okay compared to other jobs because people didn't really want to work as maids. And so, a lot of native born women, American women didn't want to take those jobs. So they were sort of readily available. And then they could save up money to send back home to Ireland. And in many cases, it was the women who were sending money home to bring their sisters as well. So that's one big aspect of their lives. I think the other is that they would, if they weren't in domestic service, they might go into factory work, which obviously lots of them did, and we'll talk about them as well. But when you get into the next generation, as they start to experience some social mobility, Irish women went heavily into teaching, nursing, clerical work, but especially teaching, so that you'll find in the cities, in the big cities, a pretty large percentage of the teaching faculty were actually Irish American women in the next generation. So they had some social mobility over the long term when they got their education and got into these more professional types of jobs.
So how did the Irish nationalist movement that was happening at the same time impact these women to fight for their beliefs?
I would say the Land League, which is the original sort of 19th century movement, was extremely important. So that's actually something that I read about quite a lot. So for women in the 19th century, for American women in general, there are certain movements that they tended to get involved in. And for sort of, again, like middle-class Protestant women, those movements tended to be the temperance movement, which is sort of convincing people not to drink. And then the abolitionist movement, of course, was very important. And then from there, they sort of moved into the women's rights movement, right? So that's sort of the traditional sense of women. But for Irish women who are just coming over, they don't have that same timeline, right? Because they're not getting involved in those other movements, or they're coming later than those movements, right? So what they're getting involved in is the Irish nationalist movement first. Or the labor movement first. And so Irish nationalism and labor, those two movements are sort of really developing at the same time. And so you'll find a lot of women doing both. So the Land League, which is basically about 1879 to the early 1880s, was for many Irish American women, particularly because there are many first generation Irish immigrants, It's the first big social movement that they get involved in. And they get involved in organizations. They might, lead and organize. They might speak in public. They might organize fundraisers. So they're doing lots of these types of activities that they really haven't done before.
Did Irish American women play any significant part in the nationalist efforts over in Ireland that ended up finding success with the Easter Rising in 1916? Or were these efforts pretty much confined to the United States?
Well, what you find is whenever there's an organization in Ireland, there's usually an American partner institution, a partner organization. So even in the case of the Land League, same thing. So in the 19th century, you had a land league and then a ladies' land league in the US, and then you had a land league and a ladies' land league in Ireland. And they actually did have American women go over to work in Ireland. Not a lot, but some American women did, but mostly they're kind of separate organizations, whereas the American groups tend to do a lot more organizing, fundraising, education. But as you move on towards 1916, you were asking about 1916, right? As you move on towards a more revolutionary movement, I think a couple things happen. One is that particularly post 1916, you start to get Irish citizens coming to the U.S. as well. So it's not just Irish Americans or Irish immigrants or Irish Americans, but it's Irish citizens who are coming over to do sort of political work and educational work in the U.S. And so after the Easter Rising, particularly the sort of wives and daughters of the men who were executed will come to the United States. And they come to do essentially like a tour where the Irish American groups organize a tour for them to go and speak, right? So someone like Nora Connolly, James Connolly's daughter, she's in the United States for like an extended period of time speaking to Irish American groups. So you don't really have Americans going to Ireland, but you have the Irish coming here. And then the other big thing that happens post 1916 anyway, is that American foreign policy becomes very sort of crucial to the Irish cause. And so Irish Americans and also Irish Republicans who are here in the US are trying to influence American foreign policy because what they want is recognition of the Irish Republic as it's been unveiled through the Easter Rising and beyond, right? So that you get Irish Americans trying to influence, Washington, D.C., right? Particularly all the way up through like 1920, 21, right? Trying to influence policy so that the U.S. will come on the side of Ireland, which gets really, really messy during World War One. So lots of stuff going on, definitely.
Absolutely. So many of us know about Irish revolutionaries like Constant Markiewicz, and we hear about Irish women having an impact on politics in Ireland. Was political participation by women, even if it wasn't through the vote, something that was much more accepted in Irish communities than in some other communities?
I would say Irish nationalism was, really, really widespread in the Irish American community. But I would also say both in the US and in Ireland, there were debates over sort of what kind of activities women should be doing. And so again, if we back up to the 19th century in the Land League, when women first started to get really involved in the nationalist movement, there were lots of debates about like what women should be doing and sort of whether or not they should be, involved. So, for example, in Ireland, the Land League it was dangerous work, and they knew the men in the Land League, they knew they were going to be arrested. They knew they were going to go to jail. They weren't really crazy about the idea of women sort of taking over the movement or also putting themselves at risk. And women did go to jail, right? Women in Ireland during the Land League days, they did go to jail. I mean, they were arrested and put in jail. in the US, again, American women weren't going to be put in jail for their Land League activities, but there was still this debate over whether or not it was appropriate for women to be involved in politics, right? And the argument generally was, oh, it's not, it's a charitable, movement because they're aiding, their sisters in Ireland, or they're helping the downtrodden victims, agricultural depression, I guess you'd call it. It was a fear of another famine, right? As you progress, though, into the 20th century, again, women are more political, right? Because that sort of debate over whether or not women should be involved in politics, that has, it's developed with, the labor movement and the suffrage movement. In other words, by the 20th century, people aren't really arguing women shouldn't be involved in politics as much, right? Because women are starting to get the vote in a lot of states and stuff like that. And so you have kind of a new generation of women who are like, well, we want to be involved in the nationalist movement, but they also, in many cases, are involved in the suffrage movement and other things. Does that make sense? So they're not breaking ground the same way those women were in the 1880s, right? Because those women have come before them. And some of them are the same women. I mean, there's a woman from Ireland named Margaret Moore, who was involved she's Irish, and she was involved in the Land League in Ireland, and she went to jail for her Land League activities in Ireland. But when the Land League ended, she came to the United States. She got involved in the suffrage movement. She stayed involved in the nationalist movement, and she's still alive in 1916, right? She's still alive. So some of those women, not all of them, because a lot of them, obviously, it's the next generation, but some of those women have been nationalists for almost over 30 years by then.
All right. And now I want to take that turn to the labor movement. And anybody who is listening to this podcast is well aware of the anti-Irish sentiments in the U.S. in the 19th century. We talk about it ad nauseum sometimes. But did those views from even other working class people make it easier for factory and coal mine owners to take advantage of Irish immigrants and Irish Americans without facing more of a public backlash?
I guess I would say, first of all, for working women, factory women, they were exploited, like, regardless of ethnicity, right? So, I think that the big issue for the Irish coming, and for many other immigrant groups, is that they're going to be in factories where they're working, in horrible conditions for low pay, and all kinds of, dangers. And the Irish react to that by being very strongly union oriented. So they very quickly kind of get involved in unions. But there isn't really much protection for workers, particularly women workers, really, in that time period. But the other thing is, because so many Irish worked in domestic service, they're not really unionized, right? There really isn't a union for domestic service workers, and they're really at the mercy of their employers because they're living in their homes. You'll see a couple of things in the 19th century. The first is that, of that sort of Irish stereotype of, the Patty and the Bridget and that kind of thing. And so there's a lot of, very derogatory humor aimed at these Bridgets, who, again, air quotes, Bridgets, but who are from rural Ireland and who don't really know, where the fork and spoon go, or how to, prepare certain dishes and things like that. So there's a lot of Bridget humor, which has been written about by other historians. But that kind of humor is, it's on the stage, it's in the newspaper, it's pretty commonplace, and it's a way for, middle-class Protestant Americans to kind of look down on these young Irish Catholic women who, don't really know about sort of the ways of middle-class America. So that's pretty prominent. But at the same time, as I mentioned before, other women, native-born American women, don't want those jobs. So those Irish women, they can get other places, right? So in other words, if they don't want to stay at the home that they're at, there are probably other options for them to move. They're in demand.
Of course, we know that workers at this time, both men and women, were facing awful conditions. but I think it gets lost just how bad things were for workers at the time. So, what were some of the improvements these women wanted, both in their own working conditions, but also for the working conditions of men and children?
I would say in the 19th century, the main ones, particularly the ones that Irish American women get involved in, but of course they have other allies as well. So it's really a complicated effort, but are shorter work days. So they want a 10-hour day or they want an 8-hour day, which the men also want, but they're going to try and negotiate that through unions and strikes, right? Whereas the women are going to try and get laws passed that say, women can only work 10 hours a day or women can only work 8 hours a day. And so this will be a state by state effort, not on a federal level, right? So that's the main one. Those laws will continue to be popular until the early 20th century. The Supreme Court will actually hear a case called Muller versus Oregon in 1908, I believe is the year. But essentially, they will support that kind of legislation. And after the Supreme Court says it's okay to have that kind of legislation for women only, then those laws will actually be passed in a lot of states. So that's actually a pretty successful one. But the first couple of laws that said women can only work 8 hours a day or women can only work 10 hours a day were passed with the help of Irish American women, for sure. The others in the 19th century, women wanted factory inspectors, but they also specifically wanted women factory inspectors, so that there would be in a workplace of young women, most of these young single, probably teenage girls, really, they wanted women factory inspectors to be hired so that the girls would feel that they could confide in them. And also because they had concerns about harassment of these girls, right? And so they knew they wouldn't talk to a man about that. So those kinds of laws, again, were things that working women and middle class women work together to pass, but some Irish American names definitely come up in those. So those are the two I would definitely mention for factory women. We haven't really talked about teachers yet, and we probably will a little bit more, but I just also want to mention that because women, Irish American women, are very active in labor unions, they also become very active in teacher organizations because they're moving into teaching in large numbers. So for teachers, because women teachers are single, generally single, and in most cities, they won't even hire you if you're married. You have to be single, but they're living on these very low salaries, very low. So one of the first things they wanted was pensions, because police and fire had pensions, veterans had pensions, teachers wanted pensions too. And a lot of that push comes from single women who need that pension because they don't have family members to help support them. And so in Chicago in particular, there were two Irish American women who, again, spearheaded the movement for pensions in Chicago and also for back pay that was owed teachers and many other things in Chicago. So when you look at the history of education and you look at women's involvement in the fight for teachers' rights, again, a lot of Irish American names will start to come up.
As we celebrate the 250th anniversary of the United States, a lot of people are going to be talking about big name figures like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and all the way through Abraham Lincoln. And I think we have a little bit too much of a tendency to highlight on people in business and people in politics. So who are some of these women who were involved in the labor movement, whether it be for factory workers, domestic workers, teachers, who we should know their names? They fought and their stories have kind of fallen through the cracks.
I chose a couple, and I can give you more if you want more. But so one of the women I chose is her name is Margaret Foley. She was from Boston. She was an Irish Catholic, second generation immigrant, and she was involved in the labor movement. And then she came to actually work for the suffrage movement. So she essentially was paid by the Massachusetts Women's Suffrage Association. And they actually sent her to Britain to study more militant suffrage techniques and sort of bring them back to Massachusetts. So this would be about 1911, 1912, probably, so early 20th century. So she goes to England and then she comes back, and her job is essentially to heckle local politicians So they send her to local rallies where again, it's Boston, right? So they're mostly Irish too. And so they're giving their stump speeches and trying to get reelected. And her job is basically to heckle them and to try and get them to commit on women's suffrage, because either they're not talking about it or they're opposed to it. And in one case, she and another woman, they actually follow, I think it's the candidate for governor. He's running for governor. And they actually follow him around from stop to stop. So every place he goes, there they are. And then he goes to the next town and there they are. And then he goes to the next town and there they are. So her job was really to be very sort of confrontational, right? But to also kind of like basically, embarrass these men and try and force them to take a position on suffrage. So she's one of my favorites. The other is a woman by the name of Margaret Hinchy, who was Irish. She was Irish born and she was living in New York. And she was kind of their go-to Irish Catholic to go. So if they wanted to send someone to like a Catholic, like a parish picnic or a church, bazaar or something like that, where they knew that she'd be talking to other Irish Catholics, they would send her because she was Irish and because she was Catholic. And so the two of them actually also worked together in the New York campaign. So Margaret Foley came to New York, and then they also traveled around the country. So it wasn't just local. They would go to Montana, or they would go to other places that were having suffrage campaigns, because they were paid speakers for the movement, but also because of their background, they were looking for Irish speakers, or they were looking for Catholic speakers. They were looking for people with strong union ties. These women really fit the bill.
Are there any rights that workers enjoy today that can be traced back to these Irish and Irish American women?
I would say, well, one of the things that teachers wanted, which is a complicated one, but one of the things the teachers wanted was equal pay for equal work, which, women teachers routinely made less than male teachers. And then even if they became principals, because many of the principals were men, but there were women who became principals, they still made less. So they would make half of what a man made for doing the same job. And obviously this is a current issue that we're still talking about today. But one of the groups that I've been doing research on was in New York City. It was called the Interborough Association of Women Teachers. And they led a campaign for equal pay for equal work. And the first three presidents were all Irish Americans.
Oh, wow.
I had at least one Irish born, I think in all three cases had at least one Irish born parent, because the teachers also, many of them were Irish as well. There's a pretty big Irish American presence there. The others, I think the most important ones, from the 19th century, as we talked about, were shorter working hours was one of the big issues for women, just getting shorter hours. But in this period that we're talking about, sort of pre-1920, there isn't really a right to belong to a union. There isn't, overtime, and like that stuff is all like later, right? But they do get pensions. They do try to get equal pay for equal work. They do try to get better safety standards, inspections, and better, shorter working conditions are all of the things that they were concerned about at that time. And also, I'll mention one last quick thing, although it wasn't as much the Irish, but the Triangle Fire happens also in the early 20th century. And so out of that comes a really big push for better safety standards. And so the Triangle Fire, because it was a garment factory, most of the workers there were primarily Italian and Jewish, particularly Jewish, because the garment industry was really heavily Russian and Polish, Jewish immigrants. But one of the women that I study, whose name is Leonora O'Reilly, she's in New York. And when that fire happened, she immediately is like, we have got to do more. We need a working class movement. We've got to do something. She writes in her diary. And she immediately founds a wage earners suffrage league. So a suffrage league for working women. And so that is a 20th century movement that's happening in multiple cities, but again, as a response to industrial conditions, right? Because working class women, they want the vote, because strikes and unions can only get you so far, and they haven't seen an improvement in their working conditions. So now they're going to focus on suffrage.
That's very interesting that you talk about that triangle shirt fire and how it was Italian and Jewish women for the most part, but Irish women saw that happen and wanted to have an influence and saw the need for change. Because I think at this time, when you're looking at the politics of men, you're seeing a lot of like the Irish won't vote for the Italian candidate. And, there's a lot of men are sort of coalescing into their immigrant groups where you're seeing maybe women are saying we have to all combine as workers. And I'm sure that's not, each individual person is different, of course, but I think you see a little bit of tribalism in the politics of men at the time, where maybe, from what you're saying, the women are looking for more of a broader working class movement. So that's very, very interesting. One of the things that I think is really important about learning from history is taking the lessons that we learned and applying them to the present day. The American labor force looks so much different now in the 21st century than it did 100 years ago. So are there any lessons that we can take, even though we're not in factories as much, we're not in the coal mines, but we are more of a service economy now? Are there still lessons that we can take from these women who fought so hard for labor rights that we can take into the 21st century?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one of the things that I would start with is that the Irish were very involved in unions. And this goes for Irish men and Irish women, right? The scholarship says that the men were disproportionately represented in leadership of unions. And what I mean by that is even as other immigrant groups were coming and the Irish were not the majority of the workforce, they were overrepresented in leadership of unions, right? Now, there isn't a corresponding study of women, but I suspect they would find the same thing, because when you start looking at unions, particularly in the organizational phase, you're going to find Irish American women all over the place, right? So the Irish in America have always been very committed to workers' rights. And I guess I would say, as far as today goes, there are a couple of things. One is that no matter where we work, we still have concerns about workers' rights, right? We still have to be on top of issues that have to do with workers' rights. So if you don't have to be in a factory or a coal mine, right, to feel like, there's some ways to improve your workplace. But I think more importantly, because I do women's history, I think it's, to me, important that we always understand the complexity of history. What I mean by that is that we see multiple voices and multiple experiences. So like you were talking about the fact that when we're going to talk about the 250th, we'll probably hear a lot about certain figures and not so much about others. And so, again, I feel like it's really important to understand like the contributions of everyday average people, right? Not the generals and the presidents, but everyday average people. And then I would add to that for us to take a lesson from that today is that everyday average people did make a difference. They did important things. We may not remember them historically. They may be very hard to find. Maybe there is no book about them, and maybe there are very few sources left about them, but that doesn't mean they didn't do important things, that they didn't, impact change in their communities, in their industries, in their states, etc. And so I think, like, I hope that makes a connection for us, if the people who enjoy history, which I am certainly one of, just to enjoy that people did these amazing things. We can still go and find them. We can still go and find new people that haven't been discovered before that did amazing things, because they are out there.
So Irish women also played a big role in the suffrage movement. And since so much of the suffrage movement was made up of upper class women, was it hard for Irish Americans to find places of prominence in this fight?
Well, things changed. So in the 19th century, you don't find as many Irish American women. You will find some, but you certainly won't find them in high places in either case, for the most part. That is true. When you get to the 20th century, as I was saying before, working class women become very, very energized for the vote. And they want the vote for different reasons than middle class women do, right? Because they do see this as part of their survival. They can't get legislation passed for better working conditions if they don't have the vote, right? So a lot of the women that I study are in fact working class women. They weren't necessarily well known in their time, although maybe in their communities, yes, I would say yes. But they are fighting for the vote for other working class women and working class men as well, right? To be able to make changes based on the labor movement. So that's one thing. The other thing that happens, though, is that Catholic women start to say, okay, well, we want the vote, but we want our own separate Catholic suffrage organizations. So that in addition to having sort of the working class suffrage organizations, you'll also have a few groups of Catholic women who are specifically working for the vote, but working separately in their own Catholic organizations. So there are, I think, times when women, whether they're working class women or Catholic women, feel like, we want to be a part of the movement, but we want to have our own leadership and our own priorities.
So just like with the labor movement, many of these women have had their stories lost to time. So when we're talking about suffrage, who are one or two Irish women who had a big impact?
Well, I mentioned Margaret Foley already, and I think, is one. Another one that I really like is a woman named Leonora O'Reilly, who was from New York. She was active in the labor movement, active in the suffrage movement, active in the Irish Nationalist movement. So again, she carries through all of them. But she was really a pioneer in terms of developing not only the labor movement, but alliances with middle class women, and her activities in the suffrage movement. So I think that's a good one. I should also mention about Margaret Foley that after she got involved in the suffrage movement, also worked for a Catholic suffrage organization named the Margaret Brent Suffrage League. So she became their organizer. So she wasn't the president of the league, but she was hired to organize women into suffrage leagues on Catholic lines. So those are a couple of good examples of Catholic women as well.
And whether it be the suffragette movement or the labor movement, would these women have viewed themselves as being Irish, or would they have viewed themselves at this point as Americans, as just as American as the middle class, upper class Protestants in the area?
I would say most of the women that I look at are at least second generation, so they're the children of immigrants. And in that sense, I think they definitely view themselves as Irish and American. I think during the World War I years, so once you get into the 20th century, it does become kind of complicated because there are these questions about loyalty for immigrants during World War I. And as the Irish in America are trying to advocate for an Irish republic, they also want to point out their loyalty to the United States, right? So they do, particularly again during the World War I years, sort of argue that, like we're American, we're patriotic, but we can still advocate for the Irish republic, right? And so you see a lot of women sort of pushing in that direction, but also sort of declaring their American patriotism. Because during World War I, there was suppression of newspapers and speakers and things like that if they were considered threat to the war effort or questions about American security, and because the Republic, the revolutionaries in Ireland, that idea of sort of taking advantage of the British being involved in the war. That put the Irish in America kind of in a difficult situation as well.
It's kind of interesting when you look at that because, and this is a whole different topic, but you have the American Revolution and the separation from Britain, and then a few years later, the War of 1812. And then even when we're getting into the Civil War, Britain is thinking about joining the war to support the Confederacy. The United States doesn't have a good relationship with Britain until around World War I. So the Irish and their animosity towards Britain doesn't really impact their status here in the United States until around World War I, because then they start to suspect that it's Germany who's sort of pulling the strings behind everything in the revolution. So there is definitely a need for Irish Americans to say, no, we're not German stooges and we're not rooting for Germany in this war. It becomes a really big thing when maybe before that, the animosity the Irish had towards Britain wasn't that big of a deal. So Tara McCarthy, author of Respectability and Reform, Irish American Women's Activism, 1880 to 1920. This was such a great conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on the Irish Baseball Podcast.
Thank you.
I'm your host, Rick Becker. We will continue to shine a spotlight on Irish immigrants and Irish Americans who've played important parts in the 250-year history of the United States throughout the year 2026. This has been episode 138 of the Irish Baseball Podcast.